Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Mike. Welcome, everyone, to the third and final session of the OAuth work group. So let's get going. First, thank you to Brent and David for taking notes. I appreciate that. And I am going to start this blue sheet around, so please use the tool to log in here. It will help us to know how many people attend and plan for the future, and it allows you to get into the queue here. Okay. The not well applies here. Hopefully by now you're familiar with this already, but if not, please take a look at that not well. It governs everything that we do at IETF, and it's important that you understand the implication of this. So please take a look at this. You probably know what to do here. So I'm gonna skip that. See if I wanna go to, just as a reminder, the OAuth security workshop is open, and the agenda is already posted. So, and if you're not interested, please register and participate. And this is our agenda for today. Paolo will start by talking about the state of European digital identity wallet. Then Oliver will talk about SD-JOT-based verifiable credentials. Tobias will talk about JOT and CWT status list and authentication-based client attestation-based client authentication. I keep making that mistake. And the last one, I think we're gonna skip, right? Okay. Just gonna skip that for next time. Okay, so I think we're good here. Any comments, questions, bashing to the agenda? Okay, thank you. Let's get going then. Paolo, get ready. Let me share your slides. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Rifat. Thanks a lot for inviting me, and it's an honor, a pleasure to be here. So really thank you. Today I would like just to give you an overview what is happening in Europe for the European Digital Identity Wallet. That is an update of an existing regulation, and that is going to create. Unfortunately, we not talk about that much about standards and and protocols, but I will give you an overview about how this project is going to create a huge demand of standardization process, especially in this field. Not sure I can change the.
You asked me, and I can advance it if you want.
Okay. The next slide. Thanks.
I can hand it to you if you want. Let me share.
Okay, so the European Council and the Parliament, together with the Commission, defining the targets for 2030 digital targets, where they envision to give to 100% of the Union citizen an access to a secure and electronic identification means that are let's say, recognized across all Europe. This is a very ambitious target. It's starting from a situation that we have already a regulation today that is allowing member states to create a digital identity schema, electronic schema, and this is an update of that process. So the three main pillars, the three main ambition are that will be free to be used by all citizens, will be accepted across the whole Europe, and we hope also beyond. If we are good to work around standards and protocols, that will also be interoperable with other places, and also secure and really privacy oriented. So this very ambitious project, then it started with a lot of pressure because and a lot of attention, and this is quite clear coming to the fact that 4 workflow I've started to work around this project. 4 different workflow that usually it's not quite usual that when during the legislation process you will have at the same time definition of the regulation with all the negotiations that are behind, the definition of the technical specification, the wallet implementation, so the wallet reference implementation, so an open source application that is going to implement also the wallet, what has been defined, and a piloting project, 4 different piloting projects. All these 4 strands are running in parallel at the same time, and it's quite challenging because obviously the legislative process is defining all the different aspects in terms of operations, how it should be deal, all the principles, everything. But also on the technical from the technical point of view, is defining also the functional and non-functional requirement of the whole ecosystem, so the whole system, so of the wallet, and also for data protection and so on. While the technical specification is the work that we are more involved in, so I'm responsible to drive the group that is behind the definition of the technical specification. And at the same time, the Commission gave also some, through the grants, gave the possibility to create a consortium that will work around large-scale pilots, because they're involved. We will see later many different subjects. What are the achievements till now about this 4 big chunk of work? So the legislative process started, the first trilogue, the trilogue, for who is not familiar with the legislative process, is the time where the council, the council, the parliament, and the commission sit together and start finding a compromise, agreed on a specific text. Okay. At the beginning, there are 3 different proposals. These 3 proposals needs to find one single solution in the final regulation, and this is started 21st of March, and it is still ongoing. And we expect to finish quite soon, in the next 1 month, 2 months maximum, in order to get the regulation adopted at the end of the year. The technical specification, what we call architecture and reference framework, is a technical document trying to explain the whole ecosystem, but mainly interfaces, protocols, and data model that would be used for the wallet, for the European Digital Identity Wallet, and also the security requirement related to the certification process that maybe I will talk later. The 4th pillar is the wallet reference implementation. The Commission decide on top of the technical specification, in order to verify also and feedback the technical specification with proper data coming from the field, to implement an open source application, an open source wallet. Okay, so at the same time, we are trying to create the main component that is a mobile application, but also the other components around that are needed for issuance for the Reliant party in order to have a small ecosystem to test and try. And this reference implementation is going to be also a kind of boilerplate, a white label app that can be used then from member states for those member states maybe don't want to develop from scratch or without any specific feature their own app. And the 1st of April. So and the wireless reference implementation is going to be released after the summer. I don't know exactly the date, but it's going to happen around September, end of September. And the large-scale pilots are started, so they signed the grant agreements the 1st of April. I will spend now a few words around the different strengths just to give you some more insights. So the technical, the architectural reference framework is a set of documents, main one and other small document defining different aspects of the ecosystem. The first release of the RF represent a kind of initial consensus between the different member states, because this document is written by a group of experts delegated by the member states and the Commission. So the work is align all the different ideas there are from the member states, from the different stakeholders, also from obviously from the private sector. This is arriving to this group in order to find a balance between the different needs they have, because as you can imagine, there are legacy systems in the member states. There are different I would say aspects that are not managed in the same way. I can give you one example. So, a unique identifier that is used for a record matching is not so common. I mean, not all the member states have one. It could have one in some cases. So there are significant differences between each member state. So this is quite complex. To increase the complexity, it's a moving target, as I was saying before, because the regulation is not defined, and the negotiation obviously are going to change different aspects, because the Parliament or the Council or the Commission are pulling from all the sides, and then obviously some features, some requirement could change during this part. But the document is published, it's public, and we are trying to release it quite often. We released already two releases of this document. It's available on GitHub, and another version will come after the summer. And the idea is to share this, to collect the feedback, not only from the member state, but also from the private sector, for any stakeholder outside during the process that we are designing the whole system. And this is also important, I believe, for this audience. Any feedback is really appreciated from experts. Few words about how it works, the mechanics of the legislation here. The IETF regulation is the main regulation. So there will be EITF regulation is the main one. And from there will be the next step will be to define what we call the implementing acts. So the implementing acts are more specific legislative documents that are describing the operational aspects, and not just the principle or different ambition of the co-legislator in the regulation, but specific procedure, for example, that should be put in place in order to reach I don't know, for example, the registration of a Reliant party, and so on and so forth. And then the implementing act also includes, as annex or in different forms, more technical document that we could call technical specification. What are these technical specifications? It's DRF, to the architectural reference framework we are writing, and what we call the rule books. Rule books are it's a concept that we introduce in the architectural reference framework to specify rules. This is kind of something what we are we are taking from the payments world, where each use case can have some specific requirements that is not necessarily shared across all. So the RF is containing the common specification. Those are needed to guarantee the interoperability and the security and so on and so forth. But each use case, for example, the mobile driving license, the diplomas use cases, or the ticketing system could have obviously different aspects of the technology stack that can be changed and specific to that use case. So the rulebooks is kind of so a document describing the specific choices of that use case or group of use cases. So all this is going to be packed as I described. So the regulation, implementing acts, and the technical specification. All of this is going to be, as soon as it's going to be adopted, is going to be effective in the whole Europe. Okay, so then the member states, they have a time to implement all these things, but it should be between 1 year and a half, 2 years. It's not be decided yet in the regulation, but during this time, the member state they will basically have to implement the whole system. How it looks like the architecture where we are. So I think this is quite familiar for you. The game starts accepting the trust. So the trust is one of the most important component because it's all about trust service EIDAS. So if you want to play this game, you need to trust the different components. How to trust, it's a very interesting topic that is not yet covered in the RF, will be covered with the next version, but it's obviously one of the main aspects. Now in the picture, you will see the mobile device is at the center, and where on the left you have the different providers. You have a PID provider. PID stands for personal identification data. So this is a very specific attestation that is giving you your identity. It's containing all the information that allows you to use the wallet with your identity. And then you have what we call the QAA or EAA. It stands for Qualified Electronic Attestation of Attributes, or non-qualified electronic attestation of attributes. These are attestation that basically the difference between qualified and non-qualified is that those qualified have a specific signature from a qualified trusted provider. It's the meaning they have because they are immediately valid cross-border, and the EAA have a different could have a different meaning. They could also be valid cross-border if there is specific regulation or not. It depends. And then we have the provider for a remote qualified electronic signature that is going to be also a service provided through the wallet. And then yes, as you see, these interfaces. For these interfaces, we already have some idea around the protocol. In the first version of DRF, we defined it, for example, OpenID for VCI to issue QAA or EAA, and for the PID, we haven't defined anything because it's more complicated because the procedure to roll out to provision the identity, it might change from member state to member state due to the legacy system, to the different procedure they have, and so on and so forth. So that will be quite complex to standardize, but it's something we are obviously willing to do. And for there are different two formats we chose. One more, let's say, internet-oriented, or it's a W3CVC or verifiable credential, and the other one is what is defined into ISO 18013 Part 5, the MDoc format with so. And for the presentation and proof, the protocol we chose, the protocols which are chosen are different from the type of flow. The remote flow is going to be supported by the OpenID for VP plus SIOP if needed for authentication, and for the proximity flow with ISO 18013 Part 5. Part 7, obviously, it's under discussion, so that might be also an option. Keep in mind that all this is changing. It could change from version to version because we are in very bleeding edge, as you know, a scenario where these things are changing very fast. So this is a picture we did at the beginning of the year, and quite probably will change, will be more detailed in few after the summer when we release the new version. Without a few example of qualified electronic attestation attribute, just to give you an idea, the digital electronic credential, it's like the passport or the ID card. Those are considered digital electronic credential. And the electronic attestation of attribute are membership card, events ticket, education credential, and so on and so forth. Well, the reference implementation of the first release will be focused mainly on authentication and identification. We'll support also MDL because it's one of the most ready standard that can be implemented as an electronic attestation of attribute. And the other release will include more functionality. So we expect at the end of the year to have a minimum valuable product that will support this feature plus most probably also the signature, at least the identification to a qualified services with the wallet. It's going to be open source, mainly under Apache 2 for the components for the software library that we are going to release, and maybe the app itself is going to be released with a different license that is called EUPL variation of GPL3 and that. So the 4 large-scale pilots. There are 4 large-scale pilots. They are working on different use cases. They brings together different member states in different public and private subject entities. Potential is mainly focused on electronic government services, bank account opening, SIM registration, mobile driving license, and remote qualified electronic signature. There are 20 countries, 56 public administration, plus 80 private entities. The C4EU, 23 country, and this is mainly working on the welfare services, and also the diplomas. So you see there is the health assurance card, and portable document A1 is for it's a document needed when you move from one state to other for the welfare. I will not go through that; it's quite complicated. EWC is focused on payments and legal person. So because the wallet is not only for natural person. This is it's something I forgot to mention. The UDI wallet is meant mainly obviously for the natural person, but also we are thinking to create an application that is going to support all the needs of a legal person. And EWC is focused on this. It's quite important. And the last but not least is Nobit. It's another consortium with less member states, but they are mainly focused on payments. So they are how to basically manage the wallet to be integrated with payments. So the Commission is financing this with at 50% of the budget, and we're around 90 million total budget was for these 4 large-scale pilots, and more than 250 participants. Yeah, there is a list of use cases that we identified where the wallet is going to be used in this way. So mobile driving license, opening account, SIM, e-signature, and so on. And this was last slide. So if you like to have some questions.
Thank you, Paolo. Questions, comments? I see Werner. Go ahead.
Werner Stahl from Core Association. Just a small question. Does this wallet support the use of a social security number in any form, in the form of a hash or just a field that could be available or optional? I mean, there's a big question about how social security numbers or equivalent unique person IDs would be used.
Yes. So the answer is yes. So in the person identification data, there will be there are details that they have to be yet defined. Obviously, for privacy, there are many different ways that we are thinking to how to do it. But yes, so it's going to support all the information that a member state needs to get to release public services. So yes, and also private service should use it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Paul?
Paul Kowalik, Denik. And the reference architecture document where the PID attributes mentioned, is there any plans for work in the standardization of the claims within this containers? Because I understand there's W3C VC as one of the containers format, but will claims be standardized for interoperability between member states?
Yes, that's the ambition. For now, we worked only on the attribute, defining which attributes are inside the PID. Yes, but yes, also the claims going to be some.
But there is no current work in this direction yet.
No, no, only the RF is talking about what are the fields that should be provided, but no, not yet. The claims are not there.
Okay, Ned?
Ned Smith. Wonder if you could say more about what it means to have an attested attribute versus just an attribute that is maybe asserted by the wallet. In other words, what are the semantics of attestation for the attribute or on the attribute?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I'm not sure I got.
I'd like to understand what the semantics are of an attested attribute versus any other attribute that is asserted by the wallet. In other words, the wallet has a key, it can sign information, it potentially signs, an attribute. Is that different from an attested attribute?
Yes. So in the vision of the regulation, basically all the attributes that are issued by an issuer that where it is that's collecting this information from authentic source, those are have a value because have been issued by a specific issuer. Now, if you for example, a public administration, okay, that is giving you the attestation, sign it with their key, and then you can sign it for the presentation, obviously. But the value that has the attribute, it's different than if you take it, generate it, or write down by yourself. So that's the main difference.
Okay, so the provenance of the attribute is included with the attribute. Thank you.
Correct.
Okay. Anybody else? Any other comments? Okay, I think that's it. Thanks, Paolo. Appreciate your time here.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Yeah. Okay, let's. Okay, Oliver. Do you want to use your mobile device or do you want to drive from here? It's up to you. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hello. I'm Oliver Terbu. I'm Director of Identity Standards at Spruce. I'm also a W3C editor on the Verifiable Credential Standard. I'm also editor of the OpenID for Verifiable Presentation Specification and one of the earlier contributors to the ISO 18013-5 specification. I want to talk about. Yeah.
Get closer, a little bit closer.
Yeah.
Or you can adjust it. Yeah. If you can raise it.
It's better. Can you hear me?
You can raise it if you want.
I will try. Yeah, so today I want to talk about SD-short-based verifiable credentials together with my colleague from Offlead, Daniel Fett. I think Daniel is quite well known in this community already. I don't know if Daniel, I think Daniel is online, right?
Yes, I'm on.
Yes.
Do you want to say something?
I don't know. I'm here to answer any questions together with you. So.
Okay. Got it. Okay. So next slide, please.
Yeah.
So since the specification is based on SD charts, I think it makes sense to recap what SD charts are. SD charts are selective disclosable charts. It's adopted by the OAuth working group already, and it enables selective disclosure of individual claims that are included in JWTs. SD chart, the specification doesn't have any assumptions on what is in the actual payload, so what is included in the JWTs. It can be anything. Also doesn't have any certain semantics. And it is not a verifiable credential format. Next slide, please. So this is how to produce an SD chart and what an SD chart looks like. So an issuer of an SD chart, they would have an input chart claim set like this. It's like sub, given name, claim name, family name. It's a JSON object, a plain JSON object. And then they would turn this into the issuer signed chart SD chart payload, which is in the middle. I think there's one specific claim that is interesting, which is the underscore SD, underscore selective disclosure, which contains a list of claims that are selectively disclosable. How is this computed? So it's every entry in the SD claim is essentially the hash of the disclosure object. The disclosure object is a JSON object which contains a salt or a nonce, some randomness, the name of the claim and the value of the claim. The payload of the SD chart can contain also non-selectively disclosable members like ISS, IAT, EXP, or also like claims specifically like the subclaim is in that case not selectively disclosable. So this is then given to the holder of the SD chart. And so what is not on this slide, but might have been helpful, I know, and it comes later in the specific slides on SD chart VCs. So the actual SD chart is a compact serialized JWT with some extras. The extras are the base64 URL encoded disclosure objects, which are separated by tildes, like a tilde character. So you have essentially a base64 URL encoded chart header, chart payload, chart signature, and then the disclosure objects which follow the chart. Yeah, and then, yeah, next slide, exactly. So what are verifiable credentials? So there are many definitions. We're using at the moment this definition. Verifiable credential is an issuer-signed assertion with claims about the subject. Paolo gave a really great presentation earlier on what are use cases of verifiable credentials in the context of the European Digital Wallet. This is exactly what this credential format can do. So you can model things like mobile driver's licenses, where the DMV is the issuer, the claims are the driving privileges, the subject is the holder of the license. Or something completely non-human, like which is, for example, you can do device attestations. So an issuer can assert or make an attestation that the device was not tampered with, has certain capabilities like hardware-backed key storages and so on. So there's actually no real limitation of what you can do with what you can basically put into a verifiable credential. Next slide, please. So far the intro. So this is now the actual meat of the specification that I'm going to present today. So SD chart VCs. So what is contained in a specification? What's the scope? It defines a profile of SD charts specifically for verifiable credentials. So I think most of you that are in this room are familiar with OpenID Connect and JWTs. And so OpenID Connect defines ID tokens, right, with additional claims. So the same way that OpenID Connect defines ID tokens, which are a profile of JWTs, this specification that we wrote defines a profile of JWTs in the context of verifiable credentials. So we define data formats, we even define a media type. I think Ori might like that. And based on, and the data format is based on SD charts, and specifically we're talking about JSON-based payloads. The specification also defines validation and processing rules for verifiers and holders of these SD chart VCs on top of SD charts. So, SD chart spec adopted by OAuth working group, IETF, defines certain rules, but we define extra rules specifically for VCs. VCs meaning verifiable credentials. Also want to point out that this specification, has also like a backward compatibility, so to say, where you could use, you don't have to use the selective disclosure part of SD charts. You can just use plain charts as well, where in that case, all the claims cannot be selectively disclosable because that's how charts work. Next slide, please. Probably some of you are familiar with this model. That's pretty common in the SSI, verifiable credential ecosystem, right? So we also have this in our spec to explain again how a typical workflow looks like with verifiable credentials based on SD charts. So you would have an issuer that can be any party. They create a verifiable credential about a subject, give that credential to the holder of the credential, could be any party again, and the holder then presents that credential to verifiers without having to ask the issuer necessarily. The holder can also create a key binding proof, which is also part of the SD chart, to basically say that it's basically it's an anti-cloning protection mechanism. Well, I can speak to that later. So then the verifier verifies the SD chart and optionally also retrieves certain status information from a status provider. And so this is basically information about the revocation status. I also want to point out that the mechanism that we have here is privacy preserving, so it respects it by implementing web privacy. But more about this specific topic, I think Tobias is going to have a presentation today later where he will speak about that. Next slide, please. What are the use cases of SD chart VCs? Issuing and presenting digital identity documents, basically the use cases that we saw in the previous presentation that Paolo gave. In the context of IETF, I would say also supply chain, integrity and transparency, SCIT's working group might find this quite useful, or content authenticity in general. I already talked about client attestations, which cover things like mobile device capabilities and so on. Then we have basically every use cases that the issuer, verifier, holder model entails, but we focus on high security requirements. Why is this important? Because you want to have mechanisms for cloning protection, forgery protection, man-in-the-middle protection. You want to use hardware-based or hardware-backed cryptography. You want to use existing cloud HSMs or HSMs, and we don't want to wait endlessly to have them support like a new cryptography that is more researchy. And we want to also like leverage hardware-backed key stores on mobile devices and become FIPS compliant. And because SD charts, developed also by this community here, it's also very likely that we can leverage like everything that this community does on post-quantum cryptography. It should be easy to combine it. I think we have a question.
Go ahead, Richard. Go ahead.
Yeah, Richard Barnes, Cisco. I was just going to throw in an additional use case here. The MLS working group and folks working on end-to-end secure messaging and conferencing have been looking for an end-to-end secure identity thing, which is specifically requires an identity credential that binds to a public key. So There was already some discussion in the MLS working group yesterday about adding a slot for verifiable credentials in MLS. And I think that community is looking for something like this or something like the user info VC stuff that's an open ID that defines a simple interoperable VC. So that's definitely a community that's interested in this work.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Thank
Okay,
you.
thanks.
Yeah, next slide. Yeah. So we also looked at our technologies. So one of the core principles we want to follow is so we already have SD charts, where simplicity is a feature, and we want to do the same with SD chart VCs. It uses a JSON only data model and regular chart claim sets. IANA registered claims, public and private claims can be also used, obviously, and it builds on well understood technologies that also this community developed and loves and uses. So other technologies in that space might be a little bit more complex, rely on less proven building blocks, maybe less composable, have some certain copyright limitations, or just simply don't really support hardware-backed cryptography, which is a requirement in a lot of these high assurance scenarios. Why can't we just use SD charts and charts? So why do we need another spec? Yeah, because initially I already mentioned that SD charts and charts are really a good basis and the foundation. We are using it, but they don't define specific requirements needed for VCs. They don't define any specific claim names and so on. Yeah, so we started the work on this specification. We started the work in April 2023. It's already referenced by the OpenID Foundation High Assurance Profile. So they are specifically pointing out to use this specification. We have a lot of interested parties like IETF 2.0 ARF. You already heard about that. They are also looking at the specification. So the spec is managed in GitHub, and obviously also welcome discussion on the OAuth mailing list. On GitHub, we have currently 28 open issues. We already have 12 contributors. And which brings me to a topic why I'm presenting this in front of the OAuth working group. Because it's based on specifications that the OAuth working group has developed, like SD charts and charts are both specifications adopted by the OAuth working group. It uses a chart-based, JSON-based data model. It relies on existing SD chart security. It is not based on the W3C verifiable credential data model. I mentioned we have 12 contributors, and a lot of them are actually from the OAuth working group. So we have the members actually of the OAuth working group already contributed to that spec, which is also why I'm here. And so generally, I think it's the right people in this room to drive this specification forward, because OAuth working group focuses on privacy and security, specifically in online and remote flows. Next slide, please. Regarding next steps, so we want to obviously have more reviews from the OAuth working group. We will work on the open issues. Also, feel free to participate in the GitHub discussions or just provide feedback on the OAuth mailing list. And then after everything progressed nicely, I also want to bring up the topic whether, call for adoption by the OAuth working group maybe, and what steps are needed there.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay, thanks, Oliver. Ned.
Ned Smith. So you mentioned that it wasn't based on the W3C verified credential data model. Is there a reason for that, or is that model broken?
No.
That's a totally fair question. Why it's broken?
It's not.
Okay.
No, it's so the W3C data model is a JSON-LD based data model. So even if so, the base media type of the verifiable credential data model is JSON-LD, and I think I already mentioned we want to have some, and it has a lot of optionalities, and that we want to just so the idea of this specification is to make it as simple as possible, because simplicity is a feature in our mind, and which means we need to make certain decisions on which claim sets to be included. We don't want to require people to read 200 pages of specific specifications. And yeah.
So is it a profile of that data model?
No,
then?
it's not.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, Brent.
Hi, Brent Sundell, chair of the VC working group at the W3C. There is currently a PR that would introduce normatively the option for other work items in other places to define a transformation to the core data model. Should that be introduced in the VC data model, would there be a part of that possible in SDJOT VC? I'm not saying the whole thing based on VC, but defining a way to transform into a verifiable credential as defined by the W3C.
Let's say it's a possibility. If it's a good idea, let's discuss.
Awesome.
Thanks, Brent. Ori.
Hi, Ori Steele. I'm also a member of the W3C Verifiable Credentials Working Group, in particular the Securing Verifiable Credentials with Jose and Cozy. So I just wanted to pick a bit at the comment about the VC data model. Obviously, JSON, a JSON data model supports JSON. JSON LD data model is also JSON. And so you have this really bad problem of I can't tell what kind of JSON you're talking about. And this has been tried, we've tried to solve this in a couple of places, and in particular, leveraging the JWT BCP work, which is why media types kind of conversation comes up. So the background around that is important because I do think there is compatibility here without mapping or with mapping. And I think mapping is the road to some forms of madness. So we should be cautious about saying that we want to talk about mapping here. I think other people may want to talk about mapping in other places, and that's fine, but I would be very cautious about talking about that here. I guess the original reason I came to the queue was I think the SDJOT specification has a structured suffix registration request, and this specification, which I'm, just to be super clear, incredibly supportive of. Definitely, please, do this work here. The experts in the room are the right people to work on securing this data model. The question that I queued to ask is, there's a part of the JWT BCP that says basically don't do token confusion, explicit typing, right? And there's an opportunity for us to leverage that to distinguish these JSON LD versus JSON credential formats. But there's also an opportunity to say the SDJOT VC type is good enough to describe VCs and to potentially lean into a kind of token confusion, but with consolidation around a primary VC plus SD-JWT media type. That would in some ways contradict parts of the JWT BCP. And I'd like to get the experts in this room to weigh in on media types and token confusion, both in the Media Man group as they're trying to figure out what that means for any structured suffix that might come in the future, but specifically to verifiable credentials. I think if there isn't consensus on how to distinguish these things or whether they need to be distinguished here, I would be cautious about doing the work. And I think we can get through that, but I think we should be clear up front around what's the design goal. Are we intending to distinguish these things, or are we intending not to? That's it.
Thanks, Ori. Richard.
Hi, thanks. Richard Barnes, a credential enthusiast, not a member of the VC working group, no association with the VC working group at all. I mean, just to briefly give my opinion on the VC topic, like I think the verifiable credential data model is fine, like as a work of philosophy, but I think there's basically nothing implementable in that draft, in that document. So just because everything is so ill-defined and optional, and like I can't write any code to that, and so like That's what I really like about this document is that it's concrete, it's direct, it's implementable. You can understand its security properties. Like you can write code that interoperates with other code. So yeah, like 100% supportive of this draft. Let's do it.
Thanks, Richard. Christina. Dick.
Yeah, I support the last two sets of comments around that this is important work. I also wanted to call out that I thought this was a very well put together presentation to provide a lot of fabulous background on someone that's not really, I wouldn't consider myself a VC expert, but to understand what you were doing, what was happening beforehand, and why we were doing this. So kudos for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jonathan, go ahead.
Hi, Jonathan Hamill from Canadian Center for Cybersecurity. I'm also in support of this work. Particularly, we have requirements for FIPS validation, FIPS validated cryptography, and some of the other selective disclosure schemes don't allow that. And so, yeah, I think that this is a good way forward. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. So I want to get the sense of this room. Like I feel that there is lots of support here, but I want to show of hands just to make sure I have.
You want to do this? Let's hum.
Well, let's do that old hum. Yeah, let's try that. So I'm going to ask a question. If you support adopting this document as a work group document? Yes and no. Hold on. Torsten.
Sorry, I was just experimenting how I could raise hand, and I decided to use in the queue. So I'm supporting adoption of that document, obviously, yeah.
You can hum too. Okay. If I'm just kidding. If you support adopting this document as a work group document, please hum now. Okay. If you oppose adopting this document as a work group document, hum now. You got it, guys. We'll do that officially on the mailing list, but yeah, seems like great support here. Thanks, Oliver. And let's keep going. Okay, Tobias, is this the right one, the first one?
Yep, that's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
You want
I
to
might
drive
just,
from your side, or do you want me to drive from here?
I might have to call on you to do that, actually.
That's fine.
Hi guys, my name's Tobias Looker, and I'm joined online today, I think, with my co-editors of this draft, Paul and Christian, I think. Do you guys want to, are you guys there? Cool.
Yep. Test 1, 2. Okay,
Yep.
yeah. Hey, this is Paul. Okay, then I'll take this for a small introduction. So my name is Paul. I'm from Berlin, Germany, and working for Bundesdruckerei, which is a German government organization that's issuing passports and ID cards and other identity documents. And we're very involved into the IDAS process, and specifically I'm looking how to enable high security use cases in the VC ecosystem.
Thanks. And Christian, are you there?
Yeah, I think you can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I'm Christian, also from Germany, working since some years now as well to somehow establish digital identities in Europe. Right now, I'm not officially an author yet, but we might change that.
Thanks. Okay, so this work is basically on a JWT and CWT representation of what we call a status list, which is a simple and scalable credential or token revocation and status mechanism. Next slide, please. So really in general, the problem here is how to enable the issuer of a token, be that potentially a CWT or JWT based representation, to communicate status information about the token after it's issued and before it expires. So a simple sort of concrete example to relate it to what Oliver just discussed with SDJWT VC is something like a verifiable credential where the issuer would like to communicate whether the credential is revoked or not after it's issued, but whilst it is still perhaps unexpired. So that's kind of a dynamic sort of aspect to the token. Next slide, please. Some key requirements we've sort of looked at with these use cases is that it must be scalable. Some status and revocation mechanisms can be really difficult because effectively you have to be able to communicate the status information of millions to potentially hundreds of millions of credentials. This issuer heard privacy, I think it could be worded slightly differently, but it's effectively how do you allow verifiers or token subjects like credential subjects, like end users that might say I'm issued a driver's license. It can be in certain situations really damaging to that user's privacy if the issuer of that credential can effectively track where they're using that credential or who they're using that with in terms of a verifier. So we refer to this as heard privacy to the issuer, which could be reworded slightly. So as to allow kind of verifiers and token subjects to remain within the herd. So if I was in a herd of 10 million issued credentials, the issuer would only know that one in that herd is having their credential potentially verified when status lists that are managed by them are accessed. We want it to work with common formats. Obviously, Jose and Coze based token credentials are Jose, much of the work is of the OAuth working group, and Coze is or IETF based standards as well. And lastly, caching support. So many of these use cases, the verification scenarios for these tokens, the verifying parties or relying parties would like to forward cache these status lists for offline verification. So be able to understand what the issuer's policy is in terms of expected update periods on their status lists and effectively forward cache them locally so they can perform these checks with a degree of confidence. Next slide, please. So the proposed solution here in a general sense is what we call a byte array based status list for a large amount of credentials. So the status is indicated by the value of a specific index. So we'll get into the representation soon, but basically issued tokens are allocated an index within a status list, and going to that index within the status list and fetching the value tells you the status of that credential. The status list in the JWT version, in both is gzip compressed, and the outcome is base64 encoded in JWT. Obviously, it's represented natively in binary in the CWT version. The status list is then signed and delivered as a JWT or a CWT. Next slide. So this is an example of a JWT of a reference, what we call a reference JWT. So the terminology in our draft is we have the status list and then we have a reference JWT, something that is the subject of a status. So a token that has a status that is being communicated by its issuer. Effectively, we have a status block here, and this status block has a URI, which points back to the status list that you can fetch through, say, an HTTP GET request. It's a public resource. And then IDX is the index of the status list. That refers to how a verifier is supposed to take the downloaded status list and go to the particular index of the status list to check the status of the referenced JDBT. Next slide.
Next slide.
Sorry. That's okay. So, and here is an example of a status list JDBT. So this is the issuer side resource, right? So the status list itself is signed so that it can be distributed perhaps by a party other than the issuer in a trusted manner, because the verifying party can verify that the status information they're looking at is actually purported by the issuer of the credential they're verifying or the token they're verifying. And so the status list JDBT looks like this, where obviously it looks like a standard JDBT in terms of the claims that you have. And the one that is unique is a status list claim. And so in here you can see there is bits and then list. So list is a gzip encoded, gzip compressed base 64 encoded representation of effectively of a bit array. And bits refers to how many bits each credential referenced in the status list is allocated. So the reason we have multiple bits is so if you have if you're issuing credentials where you need more than 2 statuses, so not just maybe active and inactive or revoked or not revoked, but you might want a suspension flag, you might want some other possible status bits. We have opted to allow an extensibility point here, which means if you allocate 2 bits, obviously you've got 4 statuses and so on and so forth represented. We do have a single namespace in terms of the statuses that we have registered. So 0 will always mean one thing, 1 in terms of the past value for the status of a credential will always mean the same thing. But with this extensibility point, we allow for future possible status values as applications evolve. So, and as I said, obviously this is signed so that the verifier can potentially cache this or fetch it from a source that is not the issuer, like a third-party hosting provider. Next slide. So this is a little bit more details on how we unpack this. So you see we have the URI. We're obviously fetching the entire JDBT. We're then going to the list. We're doing a deflate. And in this example, we're going across to index 5, and then we're checking the value. And as you can see, a past value of 0 is valid, and a past value of 1 is invalid in this case. Next slide. So really in terms of use cases, obviously the main sort of focal use cases are around digital verifiable credentials, which are in essence often long-lived sort of tokens where the issuer would like to be able to communicate something dynamic after the token is issued and before it is considered perhaps expired. So SDJDBT or the SDJDBT VC work that Oliver just presented on in the context of things like EI-2. And for those that are familiar with ISO MDoc or MDL 18013 Part 5, doesn't at present have a revocation or a status representation. So we believe that specifically the CWT-based representation would be beneficial in that space. And really broader than that, it's any use cases that have any long-lived tokens that fit these criteria, right? So perhaps not any long-lived token in general, but any long-lived token where the issuer wishes to communicate a change to a token status over its lifetime. Next slide. So we've looked at a few different approaches. We've looked at things what we call accumulated or ZKP based approaches, which can provide some further privacy characteristics, but they really don't scale well. And they're also very, very, very complicated in terms of forcing performance and scalability trade-offs. You know, and this is perhaps something for the X509 experts if they are in the room, but lots of the research and stuff we've seen is that they are really difficult to scale in how CRLs work. And specifically OCSP, going to a sort of a third party that reveals this information directly to the issuer can obviously be really damaging in the cases where it is personal identity credentials being issued. I see we've got some questions.
Right, on this point, one thing that I would add to this list of why not other approaches, and actually put that in the document too, is OCSP stapling. I think people are going to ask about that, right?
Yep.
And I think there are good answers to why not necessarily.
Yep.
But you know, just to
Justin Richer. So when looking through this presentation, this entire time I've been thinking, oh, you've reinvented CRLs and OCSP. Great. What's new here? And I think that that's something, you know, I need to read the proposed draft and figure out, you know, what the actual difference is here, because I think we do stand a risk of basically reinventing the same problems when if we're trying to slice it just slightly differently. You know, we need to make sure that we really are doing things in a different enough way to actually, you know, address those issues in a meaningful fashion.
Yep.
The other part that I'm concerned about, and this might very well be too into the weeds here, is that with that status array, what do I do when it's all ones?
What do I do?
So if the status array says every single token that you're going to ask me about is now no good.
Yeah.
Right. Do I keep that around forever so that people checking against that family of tokens, if I've already filled out all however many bits I'm allowed to have in that array, and I issue a new token, do I have to set up another of these documents that
Yes.
that's the idea?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Thank you for that clarification. That was my gut instinct, but so, you know, so again, it is a CRL.
It has some different scalability properties in terms of like
it has different scalability problems.
Yes.
I absolutely agree.
Properties, I said.
I said what I said. But that's something that I think that we need to understand more.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep. So, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. I would also, just as a final point, there's been other work that has been done looking into data constructs like Bloom filters and the like to allow sort of efficient passing of this. There are drawbacks from that, you know, the probabilistic stuff of Bloom filters specifically, but there are alternate data structures beyond just a bitmask array like this for carrying this information that people have tried. And I think that if we do bring this work in, we absolutely need to make sure we understand what other math is out there that people have tried to tackle this kind of thing with.
Yep.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks.
Ori.
Hi, Ori Steele, Transmute. So I'm sort of surprised not to see the status list 2021 from the W3C verifiable credentials on here. So it has the same fundamentally the exact same approach. And I guess I'm interested in a little bit of elaboration on why not just use that thing, since it's currently a standards track document kind of moving forward. You know, why not use that approach? And the other comment is on the compression side. There was an excellent session in TLS around certificate compression, and they looked at several different compression schemes, and gzip is great, but is there a chance that something like the Z standard or other compression algorithms are of interest here?
Yep.
Do you want agility at that point? Just to comment on that.
Yeah, so we are still looking at that particular aspect, but at the moment, that is the best candidate that we've identified for this use case. Just to come back to your question about Status List 2021, if you go back to our original design requirements to work with Jose and COSE based formats, so typically if you're doing a JWT based credential format, you want to stay within the same cryptographic data representation technologies, right, and have consistency there. So it's about sort of meeting the simple design objective.
Right. I was going to wait until you got to the end of your presentation, but since everybody else brought it up, I would definitely support some sort of algorithm agility for the actual bit set or data set or whatever it is, right?
Yep.
Because I was going to come here and make a case for SMTs, right?
So we do actually have an issue in our Git repo to discuss exactly that design extensibility point. So welcome contributions.
Excellent.
To that. Yeah.
Other than that, I think this is really good. I was going to ask a little bit about if you had played around with the scalability, actually tested, like what does it look like? How sparse can the matrix or can the list get before it's not possible to process it, etc., memory requirements, stuff like that. But we can play with that.
Yeah.
Thumbs up for getting this done.
Yeah, so Christian, I believe, has already done some implementations here. We've also done some scalability benchmarks in terms of overall representation size, how that changes when the percentage of the certificates tokens are revoked versus not, and how that sort of fits together. So we'll make that available.
Right, because the as others have said, this is a CRL, right? The big difference between this and a CRL is if we can actually get algorithm agility, so we can actually play with better compression, better, etc.
Right.
Sorry that I want to step in, because the comparison with CRLs comes up again and again, and there's fundamental differences between this and a CRL, and I want to point them out maybe now so we don't get that all again. First of all, like CRLs with ASIN1 use pretty old encoding, and the metadata that is in a CRL is extremely verbose. This alone makes the CRL in X509 very big compared to a status list. And the second most important point is that the CRL contains historic data. And that's the fundamental difference.
You're breaking up.
Don't need the historic data.
Wait, sorry, you broke up a little bit there, Paul, on your second point. Yeah, no, we're struggling to hear you a little bit.
He can't hear us.
Yeah, sorry, we can't hear you.
Okay, Aaron.
Hi, Aaron Perky, Okta. One question before I got up here to ask what I queued about. When Justin was talking, you mentioned, okay, now the list fills up with ones.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember now. Is your intent that a bit can only ever flip up, not down? So once it's full, you can safely discard it because it can never be unrevoked? Is that the intent?
When we haven't probably decided exactly on whether or not they are reversible, to be honest, because in some cases there are like applications where you might have temporary states where you might move to a suspension state where it's like the issuer is saying, I might want to go. So
that seems like a place to explore further, because it seems like there's some pretty big concerns if it can go back and forth all the time, because then you kind of have to keep things around forever. So just don't need to discuss it here, but that seems like a topic to explore further.
Right.
What I actually came up here to ask was, setting aside all the VC stuff, like go into the world of JOT access tokens. We have a JOT access token spec in OAuth. Would this work with the JOT access token spec? And I assume the answer is yes.
Yes.
But I guess more importantly is, do we get advantages by using this with the JOT access token spec that we wouldn't get with other approaches of revoking JOT access tokens?
Yeah, well, I think in general, you've got a set of trade-offs, right? Because obviously you've got token introspection, or you've got different ways in which you can call back to check whether or not a token is valid in lifetime. You've got ways that resource services handle that kind of themselves internally, but this would be another option for those applications where some of the scalability aspects or the privacy aspects might be advantageous.
Cool. Yeah, that was my instinct as well. I feel like in a lot of cases you don't have the privacy concerns in a kind of closed system of joint access tokens, but the scalability concerns definitely do apply there as well. Cool. Thanks.
Richard.
Richard Bourne, certificate enthusiast. Yeah, I wanted to respond briefly to Leif's reinvention point, because that's kind of what we do here. Like, so a properly constructed verifiable credential is abstractly a certificate in more modern encoding with some slightly more modern features. So everything we do in this working group about VCs is just reinventing part of the VC ecosystem. And I actually think we should lean into that. Like, there's been a lot of good work done about how to do good certificate stuff and good efficient verification. And I think this draft is like capturing a lot of that. I was on the team at Mozilla that did a bunch of the early prototyping around how do we capture all the verification stuff in the web PKI and compress it down. And we didn't do, like, did a whole bunch of fancy math and didn't do substantially better than gzip. So, like, I don't feel, like, given that gzip is like everywhere and easy to do, I don't think there's really any margin at all to be had in investigating more fancy math. As someone who's done the fancy math, it's not worth doing. So yeah, this seems plausible. The one thing I was going to raise here, Leif's comment about CRLs reminded me that expired credentials and how we handle those might be an interesting question, because once a credential is expired, the value of the bit doesn't matter anymore.
Yes, that's correct.
And so if we could be explicit about that, that could open up some possibilities for more efficiency, because then you can, if you got a smattering of 1 bits with expired things among them, you could set them all to 1 and have your run lengths longer.
Yeah.
Dave.
Yeah, Dave Robin. I normally don't care about privacy in my industry, but an alarm went off in my head when you're talking about this enforces this herd idea that I don't know who you're asking about is just one of this, but because it's a get, you know who's getting it. So you effectively know which business is checking on that driver's license, to use your thing.
That's correct.
So we're trying to protect against evil issuers tracking you, and yet the size of this document is up to the issuer. It can shrink it down to be a population of people that it's trying to track, including one.
Yeah, so it's not a.
How does you? I mean, it's an honor system to say I'm not tracking individuals. It seems to be up to the AS to decide how honorable to be about this herd size.
Yeah, you're quite right that a set of considerations apply around implementations for issuers to. This enables that to occur, but it does rely upon issuers issuing
Acting
sufficiently
honorably.
large hearse.
Okay,
Yes.
okay. I just wanted to make sure. 'cause
Absolutely.
normally
It doesn't.
When you're trying to impose something on "don't act evil," you're imposing it on them, not trusting that they're using the mechanism honorably.
The technology can only go so far
Okay,
in this
okay.
case.
I just want to make sure I understand.
Hi, Phil Baker. Yeah, I've done a few CRL compression schemes in my time. The big difference is between an open set and a closed set. If you know the set, the entire set of things that you're going to talk about status of, you can then use a bunch of compression approaches that aren't open to you otherwise. Besides you've got the scopes system in there. There was also a range mechanism that we came up with. You can compress on the serial number because you only need to give as much of the serial number as is necessary to distinguish from other stuff. And then finally, if you look at Rob Stradling's proposal for using Bloom filters, the way that was actually based off my stuff. And so I said, okay, we're going to identify the bad ones. And then Rob said, okay, we will use the Bloom filters in the first step to have a probabilistic first cut at what might be bad. And then we'll use your stuff to identify the good ones. And very finally, as far as reauthorizing an assertion after you said it's bad? No. One of the firmest conclusions we came out of with PKIX was that that was a really, really terrible idea. It is just horrible what happens when, I know it's in the spec. I don't think that anybody ever successfully used it, certainly not in the web PKI or PKIX. It just gets you into horrible conditions.
If you don't mind if I ask, do you mean for specific statuses like revoked, which are supposed to be irreversible, or do you mean statuses in general? Because, I mean, some statuses are by their very nature potentially temporary, right? Suspended, for example, if you do have a kind of, you're issuing tokens or certificates of credentials, suspension is, you know, by definition, perhaps a temporary state.
No, we did, originally we had suspended state and trying to use it just turned out to be a nightmare.
Right.
Yeah. Once you've said that this assertion may be bad, just forget it. Issue a new one. That's the way to go.
Mike.
Hey, Mike Perrock here. So I wrote the status list stuff over on the W3C side that gets us this kind of basic functionality. And I did want to share a couple of learnings from that with the group. And by the way, I'm thankful to have native registered claims because that's what I prefer, but that's a different story. You know, couple of key lessons. One, when we're looking at this kind of thing where it can be distributed out over a CDN or playing with potentially a three-party model, that's one of the nice things about it. Also gets at some of those herd privacy things. There is a difference between issuing time and how many times the certificate needs to be signed versus the client instructions, like with DNS. How often do I refresh this? Is what's the TTL on it, basically? And so I'd recommend adding a TTL property for sure, based on that and based on conditions we've seen in the real world. I think the other thing to bear in mind is the semantics and difference between status and verification and what you're really after. Because when we say something like status, what we're really talking about is that could potentially be general, and that may or may not have verification instructions alongside it. And a common real world scenario where that's been popping up for us has been in using credentials that or some kind of signed packet that represents a digital twin of a real world item. And so when we look at regulatory items there or digital twins of physical IoT devices, for instance, sometimes you actually have to represent the status and distribute that. And that code may be predetermined in some kind of regulatory body, et cetera. So there is this notion of an informational status that may be externally defined, and being able to give a pointer to say, hey, go look at this, you know, registry here, or this lookup table, or sometimes a PDF, frankly, in the case of like government cases, that say what these status codes mean. And I would caution on locking out the ability for someone who wants to represent those statuses from not being able to pass through the exact values, say a status value coming off the wire, or coming off a chip, or coming from a regulatory body. So making sure that we can distinguish between this is an informational status or status with external business rules versus this is verification instructions. I want to fail you, or I want to, because those two things do get confused and they should not be treated as the same thing. So
cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Brent. Okay. Yeah.
Maybe. Oh.
Yeah.
Brent Sundell. Once again with my VC working group chair hat on. The approach that you've described here seems remarkably similar to the approach that's taken in the W3C status list, particularly recent modifications to that. It seems as though there is a very common core that would be usable in both. And I think it would be very valuable to explore those similarities. The common core being that bitmap description. If the bitmap description in what you have here that you then take and gzip and turn it into a JWT or a CWT, if once I undo all of that, I get the same thing that in the W3C approach is wrapped in a W3C VC, I think there's value in that. So if we could explore that possibility, I would really encourage us to do that.
Yeah, I think that piece alone, in terms of at present in the specification, isn't that significant. So I think the exercise and maybe abstracting it out is probably less less of a value to both specifications and time, but I'm sure we're happy to look at that.
Okay, so I think we probably we want to wrap this up right now. So, but I wanna ask a question. Like, it seems that there is support for this document, but there are some concerns with this document. So, my question is, those concerns, do they prevent us from adopting this document? Do we need to wait for this? Are there real concerns that must be flushed out before we call for adoption? Anybody has any thoughts here?
Justin Richer. My main concern for this work in this working group is actually the scope and charter of this working group.
Yeah.
This seems pretty clearly outside of just OAuth.
Right.
And why isn't Brent's working group doing it? Like, I know that's a whole other discussion.
Right.
But look, I'm not asking that to be answered right now, but that is a question that we need to ask ourselves as a working group. Is this the right home for this work? To me, it doesn't feel like it actually fits here.
Mhm.
I think it's interesting and important work. I think it is an important reinvention of a wheel. We reinvent wheels all the time, right? That's how we get round ones. And it's true. But it's something that is this a wheel that needs to be reinvented here? I'm not convinced it is.
Okay, thanks, Justin. Roman.
Hi, Roman as idea. I guess I have two requests. One, I would like to talk about non-round wheels at some point, like, and how we got here. That seems like that would be a good kind of conversation. But seriously, what I was going to do at the end of the working group meeting, but I guess I'm going to do now since we mentioned the C word, is just kind of, from my perspective, there is a lot of excitement I'm hearing in the working group around verifiable kind of credentials. It is a complicated ecosystem. I certainly don't have my kind of head wrapped around. I know there's a lot of work kind of in the community. Thrilled that we have a formal W3C kind of representation kind of here. I don't know whether we need to step back and refactor the charter, but that is absolutely a conversation I kind of want to have so we can better clarify what our trajectory is around this body of work. And that's setting that aside, how do we codify kind of that trajectory? Is it as formal as something we have to put in the charter, kind of where that line might be? Kind of, do we liaison kind of things, or where we kind of think about that? So as we think about adoption of anything in this space, I want to make sure we have an explicit kind of charter thing here.
Yeah,
because OAuth is one of those very long-standing working groups. As everyone knows, it's a very vague kind of charter, not touched in a really long time, which is good and bad.
Fair enough. So yeah, like, we've been talking about this VC coming to the work group as a step into creating a dedicated work group later on. So we'll have to think about it carefully and exactly how to do that. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the surface, for everyone's kind of benefit, Rifat, Hannes, and I have been having kind of that conversation exactly how Rifat kind of described is, when we kind of had that conversation, I said, we have no other place to start this conversation, so absolutely let's start an OAuth, but it was not a foregone conclusion that the conversation would end in it being kind of an OAuth. And I think it sounds like, again, I walked in late because I was double booked with NAP. It seems like we have a momentum here. We should step back and say, how do we refactor and how do we do this and where? And if that's an interim meeting, that kind of makes sense, or kind of all the rest of it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Roman. Leif.
All right, just to reiterate my support. So practical and all of the refactoring aside, Roman, and I think I understand why you want to do that. But, the facts of the matter are that OpenID Connect is going to have a significant role to play in the EU wallet ecosystem, and there is a lot of stuff happening there. let's start the work somewhere. And right now, OAuth is as good a place as any to get it started. So I would argue, let's do what we need to do in order to get stuff going. And this particular point is possibly the single unsolved point that remains to be done before we can get actual traction for OpenID Connect based wallet ecosystem. So it is really, really important.
Going to use my AD kind of prerogative to step in front of everyone.
Yeah.
Kind of my apologies. To the point of, to reiterate kind of what I said and to overlay that on what you said, get started can mean a lot of things. I guess I just want to be really clear. My threshold is we can continue to talk about it, but get started does not mean adoption for me until we have the conversation, which, you know, if folks don't think that's a reasonable kind of threshold, you know, please come up to the mic and let's chat.
I think it's reasonable. Again, like we can continue that discussion on the list. We can keep that momentum, and we can at the same time start that discussion about either rechartering, creating a work group, a different work group. All of this can happen at the same time. So, but yeah, I agree with Roman here. Christina.
Yeah, Christina, to be clear, I think a lot of us, when we say get started, we mean the draft being adopted. There are a lot of ongoing implementations that want to rely on these drafts, and they are looking for something reliable. And that ID turning into an adopted draft is a big line that a lot of us really want to cross. There's work in EU, in America, in Japan, around the world that really needs us. Having said that, Justin's point acknowledged, and really grateful for Raman stepping up. So if we can revisit the charter of OAS, if that's necessary, like I think we should definitely do that. Because, for example, waiting for formation of another working group or even waiting for HUDIS to mature is honestly not an option for a lot of us who want to rely on this work.
So let's explore all of this. So we don't have to make that decision right now. Again, like we could recharter, we could work on creating a new work group. That's a discussion that we could have quickly in the coming few weeks. Is like just setting another meeting, a virtual meeting, and we can start that discussion as soon as possible. So. But let's explore that. We don't want to make that decision right now. We can't make that decision right now. Mike.
Yeah, Mike Parek here again. I do want to emphasize support for this. I think we need native CWT and JWT representations of this kind of information. One of the challenges is in use of this in a standardized way. And as someone like many of us here that has, for better or worse, a foot in both sides, right? We're working both in VC working group as well as in IETF. This may actually be better suited to COSE or somewhere like that for a variety of reasons. One of the advantages IETF has is that we can look at this work as a way of doing significant improvement to the limitations we have from a web constraint and things like that at the W3C. So because that work that is effectively logically this with different names, like literally you could just change the tag names and it's identical. It's pretty close to completion there, right? It's going to be going to candidate recommendation, I think in 6 weeks, and then go through review and go through TR. The concern that I have that might be difficult or could be handled with an informational draft maybe somewhere, right? Which is to say, well, what are these things so that we're at least working with something that's functional while we figure out the best way to carry this forward so it actually is a significant improvement, particularly on a lot of different things like bit string expansion, but frankly, what about things that have an array of statuses attached to them? These are things that there are good approaches to, especially in CBOR, right? But that are not being covered by the current approaches due to complexity there that would be well and much better handled here at IETF. Now, we're in IETF, I think that's up for grabs, right?
Okay.
So.
Thorsten. Thorsten?
Yep, just took some time to unmute. Hey, this is Thorsten speaking. So I'm one of the contributors to SDJ.VC and also the status list and other stuff. And I'm super excited about that work because it will help us in the European Union to implement the vision of the IDAS that Paolo illustrated. So I'm absolutely in line with Leif and Christina. There's work going on that is based on SDJ.VC, and status list is a very important underpinning to manage the status of those kind of credentials. And this work right now is being done in the same group. So the high assurance profile, SDJ.VC, status list, and the client attestation draft that will be coming next is all done by the same people in one group. And I think we should keep it that way, at least for the interim. I personally think a new working group will be a better place to conduct that work. And we were already brainstorming about names in the chat. So, but for the time being, and just to give you some indication, by the end of the year, the technical underpinning of EIDAS 2 must be defined. So there is not much time. So we should really invest our energy in evolving the draft. So that's why I'm arguing for keeping both status list or adopting both status list and VC SDJ in OAuth, admittingly that the status list is out of the charter, of the scope of the working group. I know that, but the people are here to work on that. And yeah, we need a solution for that. Thank you.
Thanks, Thorsten. Paul. Paul.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, this
Yes.
mobile client is driving me crazy. I'll try it now. So yeah, Thorsten addressed most of the points.
Still same problem, Paul. Paul, still same problem. It's you're breaking up. Richard
Barnes, velocity enthusiast. Just wanted to throw a little more fire, fuel on the need to go fast fire, because I think, like I said earlier, the end-to-end secure messaging MIME stuff is driven by DMA compliance deadlines, which are coming up rapidly in IETF terms, and so they don't explicitly have a dependency on this stuff yet, but they're going to need an identity layer, and this is, I think, one of the more plausible candidates. So I agree, we need to keep this clean and process-wise. We probably need a recharter at least, if not a new working group. I think Thorsten's probably right that a new working group would be the conceptually cleanest approach.
Right.
But I think we need to figure out how to address the concerns Christina raised about having serious engagement here and demonstrable engagement, while also doing that cleanest. I think probably doing a quick recharter, adopting this in this group, while potentially having some discussion in parallel about a broader working group, a working group more focused on VCs directly. I think that's probably the right way to maintain process coherence and velocity.
Okay, thanks. Richard. John, I've closed the mic already, but
I'll be quick. I agree with Richard. I think we need to strike the iron while it's hot, or whatever the analogy is. I don't necessarily agree that we need to recharter to do a status list for JOTs, because we are responsible for JOTs. Yes, it can be used for other things, but I think if we concentrate on, yes, we have JOT access tokens, how do you revoke them after that? I think that is within our scope. I think we probably have justification to, without too much rechartering, actually adopt these things, get started, make a decision about, yes, maybe some of our work could be spun out into another work group later, but start now.
Okay, thanks, John. So from an adoption perspective, we're gonna take it to the list either way. So I'm not gonna call for adoption right now. So let me talk to the chairs, talk to the ADs, and figure out something that could be done quickly, and then we can call for adoption on the mailing list if we figure out, as soon as we figure out a quick way to kind of move it forward. Okay. Thanks. So you're staying, you have another one, but before you go to this next one, I was asked that I think Hank has some questions or comments about the previous ish. I see you puzzled there.
This is Henk. My attention span is unfortunately on a Friday. So I just want to say we have a hands tool, and I think it would be wise to use it because then you have an in-room measurement of adoption.
Well, this is just to get a feeling. Official.
Yeah. It is not official, but I have no idea, and I would like to know.
You have no idea about what?
What the feeling of this room is, and I would like to see it.
It's for me to feel it.
Yeah, I would like you to feel that.
So.
Please.
Again, let me step in as AD as a process thing. Absolutely, we are running a hybrid meeting. We got to make sure we enfranchise folks in the room and those that are kind of remote. Yeah. We had some folks that were remote that did not feel like they have a say. After we finish this topic, after we put a pin on it at this meeting, we are obviously not done with this topic. We're going to take a break. Folks that did not feel like they could have a say when they were remote, they may have walked in the room. We're going to do a process inject, and then we're going to get back to our regular scheduled programming.
Okay, next. So, is this the one, right? This one?
Yep, that's it. And again, Paul, who's on the line with the last draft, is my co-editor on this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a draft called Attestation-Based Client Authentication for OAuth2. Yes. No? We're going to take a break before we start the new topic. Sorry.
But that was the break, like for hand. Is it that like is that?
We asked you to mic for anyone remote if they have anything to say, please stop the mic.
Okay. Anybody remotely has any questions, comments? So, okay, keep going.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so this is, as I sort of said, attestation-based client authentication for OAuth2. So next slide, please. Sorry, next slide. I think these slides are the wrong ones.
Let me show. Which one do you want to? This one? The last one? This one.
Perfect. Sorry.
This one?
Back one. Yeah. So motivation here today, there's been lots of conversations around attestation. So the first thing I want to do is kind of caveat that this positioning is quite specifically narrowly focused on a piece of attestation, but we believe the draft is generally applicable to a wide range of usage of attestations that are emerging. So in general, I'm putting public in asterisks here, obviously, because that terminology as OAuth has evolved, has become less reflective of the environments that clients are typically operating in today. But in general, what we have is clients from an OAuth2 perspective are now operating in many environments where there are attestations, platform-related attestations that are available that can be used to help facilitate them perform client authentication where they otherwise might not have good solutions today, right? So when we talk about the kind of traditional public client in OAuth2, they typically don't have any form of direct client authentication options unless they do like a back-end for front-end style pattern. So the question is, given things like App-Attest on iOS and Play Integrity and various attestations becoming available and more commonplace, how do we appropriately use these sorts of capabilities to allow clients to sort of authenticate with an authorization server? Next slide, please. So this is sort of jumping straight into a proposed solution is probably the best way to sort of communicate what we've been working on. We propose to extend the established framework of RFC 7521 for a new form of client authentication. So for those that are unfamiliar with that draft, it's like the JOT assertion framework, which is what gives rise to private key JWT client authentication method, or I think it goes by another name in OAuth as well. Loosely in this model, if you think about this in a concrete example of public clients, typically, if you think about web apps or native applications, there's many instances of the same client as one possible mental model framing, right? Like every app installation on a mobile device is an instance of that client. They all often share the same client ID. And in this model, there would be effectively a backend service known to that client where the client instance can generate an attestation key. It's basically an asymmetric key pair. And then perform a protocol with its backend to that might involve sharing those platform attestations like app attest if you're on iOS, or any other platform attestations available to you. And effectively, you'll get an attestation back from that sort of back end that is signed with a key that is trusted for that client by the authorization server. Note the protocol for 2 and 4 are out of scope. Really what we're trying to do in this draft is define what this attestation looks like as a JOT, like how it should be validated, how it's processed, what the processing rules for both the client and the authorization server are, and how you put it in a request, like a token request, like an Auth2 interaction, a token request or PAR endpoint and the likes. And so because the protocol steps of 2 and 4 are out of scope, that backend and instance communication is free to be as elaborate as possible, as elaborate as that implementation so chooses. Next slide. The kind of key call outs here is the client authentication method that's used in 6 is actually a proof of possession enabled, in the sense that the backend basically signs creates an assertion, signs over the client instance public key, and then the client instance does a proof of possession and includes the attestation obtained from the backend when it interacts with the authorization server. We've got some examples that show how this looks concretely in the form of JWT a little bit later. Another point to highlight is that when you look at use cases or applications like Depop, which are sender constrained access tokens, for those that are familiar with that draft, Depop doesn't handle how you authenticate the Depop key. So when a client turns up in a token request and is requesting a bound access token, the authorization server has to kind of trust that because that key's there in combination with an authorization grant, like an authorization code, that somehow kind of authenticates the client, but it's pretty informal. This draft can be layered on top to authenticate that Depop key. So an authorization server, when it's issuing an access token, can say, I know I'm issuing this access token to a client instance that is, if I trust the process that's happened that I'm not aware of, which is between 2 and 4 of how that attestation was generated, then the access token I'm binding to, I know, is for a key for that genuine client instance. It's a direct mode of authentication between the client instance and the authorization server, rather than say a backend for front-end style pattern where the instance would talk through the backend to the authorization server. And it avoids the need for the client instance having to register with the authorization server for DCR, via DCR, sorry, like dynamic client registration, because the instance could be one instance sharing a common client ID, and it is effectively just being able to authenticate to the authorization server. Next slide. So this is just probably an expansion for like a native app. It's largely the same diagram, but just to be clear, if you have a mobile application running on a mobile OS, it's an instance, and that in that use case, it can talk to potentially the TPM or SE that's available on that device. In one, it's obviously generating the key and probably a platform attestation. In 2, it's basically requesting from its backend to please validate this platform attestation and give me a client attestation. The backend does that validation, responds with it, and then the mobile app is now in possession of that attestation and can use that for any OAuth 2 interaction where client authentication is required. And as you can see, the authorization server can validate that kind of attestation chain per se, because it trusts the public key for that client that was enrolled when the client itself might have been registered through an administrative process. Next slide. So this is an example token request. Next slide. So you can see here the things that are different for those that are familiar with the RFC 7521 client assertion type. We've defined a new URN here, which is a JWT client attestation. And so that's what's new. Next. And you can see basically what we have here is two JWTs concatenated via tilde character. For those that are familiar with SDJWT, it's effectively the same sort of syntax. You've got the client attestation, and then you've got the client proof of possession as two concatenated JWTs. Next slide. So this is that kind of expanded caveat before people try and validate the signatures on this. I did mess with the JWTs in preparing these samples, so the signatures are not valid. But we have effectively the client attestation separate with the tilde, and then the client attestation POP or proof of possession. Thanks. So this is the client attestation. Basically, it's an ordinary JWT. Note the issuer here. At the moment, we elaborate mainly on the model where the issuer is the client itself because it's the client's backend. That could be just an ordinary client ID, or in future potentially something like a URL as a client ID. And you can see we're using the RFC 7800, I think, which is the confirmation claim, to represent the key, the client's attestation key, right? So effectively the client attestation says that this key this attestation requires confirmation with this key in order to be used as a form of client authentication. So we've got someone on the queue.
Hey, or still transmute. So just on the CNF piece, is there a use case where you don't embed the key directly, but you do a key identifier like you can in 7800?
Yeah, so that's obviously supported in 7800. At the moment, we've kind of tried to limit it towards JWK just for optionality's sake. But you know, strictly when you look at 7800, that is possible. Yeah.
George Fletcher, having done some of this in the past, we often looked at requirements of nonce in the beginning of the flow with the authorization server, so it can prove that the attestation is something that's related to the interaction with it and not just some random value that's showing up from the client, even though I trust, you know, even though the key chain is there. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, so I didn't know if that was some of the thinking or if there was an explicit reason you weren't sort of looking at that.
Yeah, typically you wouldn't do it in the client attestation because the client attestation is issued to the client instance and then it generates a fresh POP every time it's talking. So the involvement of a nonce from the authorization server would be something that would feature in the proof of possession. At the moment, we haven't elaborated on that. We kind of rely upon the fact that most of the interactions are like, you know, exchanging a grant where you like an authorization code in a sense is one-time use. So you do have some replay attack kind of detection there, but
yeah, I mean, it gets into the whole aspect of, I mean, as an authorization server, I could easily say you know, you're doing something like PAR, right? And you're starting an authorization request, and I want the client attestation as part of it, right? Earlier, right? Today, this is one of the problems we have in OAuth is there's no real way to do client authentication at the beginning, right? It's only sort of when you get at the token level. And it would be nice to be able to do it before you start your authentication pieces, because an attestation of the client, first party, not first party, all sorts of other things at the authorization server level gives you knobs you can turn in the sense of reducing friction for users. So in that context, right, I would like to basically have my authorization server nonce in the attestation issued by the client backend, right, so that I can show that these things are all connected.
Yeah, so you could, just to come back to it, you can use this with PAR though. So if you're talking about, you know, pre-authorization request, you can use it in that part of it.
Right, but the point I'm making is that the client attestation is generated outside the context of the authorization flow.
Correct.
And I would like to bind them together.
Right, okay.
Aaron.
Hi, Aaron Brecky, Okta. I know we're getting kind of in the weeds into your proposal here, and I wanted to take a step back to talk about some of the higher level stuff. I am glad to see this proposal. I presented at OSW last year about kind of the overview of the options and got generally good feedback that people are interested in this. So this is a good sign. One, I guess, nitpicky thing is technically if you're calling this a form of client authentication and then using it for public clients, then they're not public clients anymore because public clients by definition don't have authentication. So that kind of gets into the main point here, which is that I think that any kind of attestation like this is it's a hint, it's a signal, and it's some input that you can use to make a decision, but it's not an absolute. And there's actually a lot of points in the various parts of the OAuth flow where that kind of signal is useful. And we have the dynamic client registration endpoint to kind of kick things off, and a search attestation would be very useful there. We have the token endpoint where tokens are actually issued from, which can be a place where you want to see the attestation as well. And then you have the PAR endpoint, you also have the resource server, which may also care about it aside from any other tokens that are included. So, you know, in the OAuth world, we would want to be able to layer it onto all those different parts. So I also wanted to point out that actually at Okta/Auth0, we've done some deployments of extending the token endpoint to be able to accept iOS specifically attestations, and have had very good luck with that. And it's able to prevent quite a lot of the kind of spam and attackers that are trying to abuse the fact that these are public clients that don't have authentication. So it is effective at that. So at the token endpoint in particular. So I was thinking maybe at you know, one way to kind of handle this would be to treat it more as a additional signal that you can add anywhere in the space. So rather than using it as a replacement for authentication or as a replacement for, you know, one particular one, being able to put it in everywhere. So kind of like how we have Depop, which can kind of be used anywhere at any endpoint that we've defined, whether it's a resource server or part of the authorization server. This would be an excellent thing to be able to use in the same way. So think of it as an extra HTTP header you could send to a token endpoint, the PAR endpoint, a resource server, or whatever it is. And then, you know, you get all these properties across the whole ecosystem.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. John.
So in the various proof of possession things that we've done over the years, this was always sort of the missing piece because we didn't actually have the operating system APIs to generate this. So doing this work to close that loop is, I think, something that this working group should take on, definitely. I'm not certain that we need a challenge from the AS. I have more comments than we have time, and I will review this. And I think we should probably move forward with, if not this, something very close to this, because it is needed by lots of people in, as Aaron said, a number of different places in the flows.
Thanks, John. Torsten. Okay.
Hey, this is
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, but the tool takes at least 3 seconds to unmute. So please give people in the remote queue some time to unmute. Okay, Thorsten speaking. Just reflecting on two comments. So first of all, George, yes, we are looking for a way to really get a AS-provided nonce into the flow. And as Tobias pointed out, the code, for example, could be working as that. I just want to point out, I don't think it's a good idea to include that nonce into the attestation itself, because attestation typically is something that is long-term and can be stored on the device for subsequent use for multiple uses. So we would put that in the proof of possession. Just making clear, because that has a different consequence, right? And second, Aaron, the reason why we started that work around client authentication is pretty simple. Especially in the IDAS and other spheres, it's important to really make sure you're talking to the right application, and then do some authorization on top of it. So, for example, in the IDAS, you need to make sure that you're talking to a European Digital Identity Wallet that is certified. So that's the reason why we started that work there, as an extension, as a client authentication mechanism. But obviously, the attestation format can be used in other places as well. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Thorsten. Peter and Justin, quickly, please. We are over time here.
So I'm Peter Kasselman, very supportive of this work. I think good comments about maybe generalizing it in other ways, but the application that I see for this very specifically in the workload identity space, the authentication piece is really interesting. So to me, this fits a problem space that I see. Thank you.
Thanks. Justin.
Justin Richard, +1 to all of the comments on generalizing this. There have been a lot of conversations this week alone about where attestations fit, not only client to AS, but also client to RS, as Aaron mentioned, but also AS to client, because this can solve some discovery problems that we see in the wild as well. So a general purpose mechanism for carrying this stuff around that is not specifically bound or tied into client authentication or even Jose, I think would be a very good thing to be able to have. That said, to the previous point of where you put in the nonce that I think it was Torsten said, it's been a long queue. I've lost track of who said what. The bundle of the proof of possession should absolutely be separate from the attestations themselves, and because the attestations can answer a lot of questions outside of just the proofing of keys associated with it and the context in that. So I think this is a great stab at it in a specific case. I think we really need to pull this concept back, and because this is going to touch a lot of different places and solve a lot of problems that people are having today.
Thanks, Justin, and thanks, Tobias.
Yeah, I do have a couple more slides to finish, or we over?
We are way past.
We're way past
the time.
Okay.
So it's from my perspective, I feel there's lots of support for this. So we're gonna try to call for adoption over the mailing list. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, oh, yeah.